Okay, selamat pagi semuanya. Good morning everyone. Thank you for coming to this very interesting but also important lecture. But before we start, please fill in the first row, sit, don't be shy. Okay, come on, maju ke depan. Harus ada teman, Steve sendirian di depan.
Maju yang belakang isi dulu, yang baris depan ini.
John, maju.
1 menit boleh?
Ya. Depan sekali pun bisa. I think we are very lucky that today we have Dr. Katherine McGregor. She's an associate professor in Melbourne University from the School of Political and Philosophy Studies. And you might heard the name. She's the author of the History in Uniform, the books. It just has been translated into Indonesia, sejarah dalam seragam. You know. Thank you. And she also has published quite a number of articles in several outstanding journals about Indonesia, mostly about the political memory of the violence in the past of Indonesia. 1965, 1945, about Westerling, etc. And today, she's going to speak about her new project. It's about the comfort woman, Yugun Ianku, and who, maybe you have heard about this system. It's women who were mobilized to serve as a, how you call it, it's kind of sexual slave by the Japanese military administration in Java, but also elsewhere in Nusantara, in Indonesia. And I think this is very important and really interesting topic for us. And I don't think I need to introduce Kate because she has been here also giving another talk like last week. And I will give Kate the opportunity, like, yeah, you can take as much time as you wish, and 1 hour as well is okay, and then we'll have a discussion after. Okay? Silakan.
Terima kasih terima kasih semua untuk datang ke sini pagi ini. Sebetulnya saya kalau lihat judul saya terpotong ya, mestinya judulnya Piecing Together the Threads of the So-Called Comfort Room System during the Japanese occupation of the Netherlands West Indies. So I will speak between Indonesian and English, if that's all right, because sometimes the language on this topic is very sensitive. So first of all, I wanted to say something about the broader project that this comes from, because today I can't present the entire project, but I will give you an overview. So the broader project is a 4-year project called Confronting Historical Injustice in Indonesia, Memory and Transnational Human Rights Activism. And this is funded by the Australian Research Council, and for this project, UGM is also my host university. So in my presentation today, I'll be talking about what we can know about the background of this system in Indonesia. Indonesia, but I'll also give you a glimpse of activism related to this topic. There are many gaps in what we know about the system in Indonesia, and I also wanted to preface this by saying that I'm talking about a very sensitive history, of course from the point of view especially of the women who suffered sexual violence during the Japanese occupation of Indonesia. So my intention is to try and place women at the centre of my narrative, but sometimes this is very difficult because of limited sources. So a little bit more background. What is the system of, or what was the system of enforced military prostitution? That's a term that I usually use, enforced military prostitution, meaning that wanita biasanya dipaksa untuk melakukan ini. This system was used by the Japanese military before and during World War II. Approximately 200,000 women were recruited, and by very different means, from Japan, also Korea, China, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, East Timor. There was coercion of these women not only in the recruitment, but also in their daily lives, in terms of not being able to leave where they were held and being enslaved. One thing that's also important to remember, as I said, is that the terms used for comfort women are very sensitive. In Indonesian, that would be wanita penghibur, or yugunyanku, Yanjo is the name of the place that the women were held. But all of those terms, for many surviving women, are very difficult to accept. Mereka sangat, kata-kata seperti itu sangat sensitif. Jadi ada wanita yang menolak total termnya yugunyanku karena mereka menolak kalau mereka menghibur prajurit. So I tend to use so-called comfort women, or I use kutip for the word comfort women. This is very important to indicate that this word is contested, that a lot of women don't like that word. It in fact is insulting to them. Today, the case of yugunyanku is sangat terkenal di seluruh dunia mungkin karena ini termasuk surat keras hampir setiap tahun, khususnya aktivisme dari negara Korea itu yang paling dikenal, paling dikenal di dunia. And it has also been the cause of diplomatic tensions between South Korea and Japan. So in many cases there have been high tensions between those two countries at the centre of their diplomatic relations. How can the case of the comfort women be resolved today? But as we will see, for Indonesia, this has not been a fundamental issue that is disputed between Japan and Indonesia. Okay. So, how do we think about the history of the comfort women in Indonesia? How far back should we turn the clock to understand the system and how it worked in the Netherlands East Indies? Well, I believe that we need to know about general practices in sex work in order to understand what traditions the Japanese might have drawn on, as well as local attitudes and experiences of sex workers in the colony. So I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of pre-war society to establish the dynamics of sex work in the colony, including the range of women who engaged in sex work before the Japanese occupation. So I think it's also important to gain an understanding of sex workers because they were the first group of women to be recruited by the Japanese army. They were forced by the army and the navy to work in a range of facilities providing sex. And there was also some continuity in the kinds of facilities or places, iando, that were used for holding women compared to places that were used for sex work before the war. I also think that we need to look back in history in order to understand local attitudes towards sex workers that might have carried over into attitudes towards women who were co-opted into the so-called comfort women system. So what do we know about sex outside marriage before the Japanese occupation? I would argue that sex outside marriage was strongly connected to the context of imperialism. The practice of keeping nyai was largely a result, or live-in housekeepers, was largely the result of shortages of Dutch and Chinese women and taboos on interreligious and cultural marriages. So Dutch women, there were far more Dutch men in the colony than Dutch women, as most people will probably know, The Dutch women were reluctant to come to the colony because it was so far away, and because there were also concerns about their health. There were bans also on Christian and Muslim marriages until 1848. And colonial employers, including the VOC and then the colonial bureaucracy, were also very reluctant to let many men marry Dutch women because that would mean more costs for them in supporting a Dutch wife. So why also, if we think from women's perspective, would they have engaged in such relations? Why would women have become nay in this period? We know that women could have increased their social capital, maybe acquired wealth, but we also know that they had few rights in these non-marriage relationships. They could easily be discarded by Dutch or Dutch men at the discretion of these men, and they could also decide whether or not they recognised the children from any relationships. The position of nyai, or concubines, of lower status Dutch men, such as men in the Dutch army, was even worse. They had to live in the barracks with Dutch soldiers and could be expelled or thrown out of the barracks with their children at any time. We know that sex workers in the colony had diverse backgrounds. They included Indonesian women, but also Dutch women, and also Japanese women, as I'll explain in a moment. Just before the war, in 1939, an expert on combating venereal diseases, Simons, wrote a paper on sex workers in the colony. He recorded the patterns of sex work that he observed in the port city of Surabaya. He noted that sex workers were generally from the poorest classes and were usually local women. This included women working on the streets, in cafes, hotels and brothels. But sex work in the colony also intensified in conjunction with the expansion of global capitalism. As the demand for goods like tobacco, rubber increased, colonial officials began to import largely male workers from China and India, and also from other islands of the colony. And these workers were moved across the colony or from outside the colony into plantations and used also for building infrastructure. So the number of male workers in the colony also largely outnumbered the number of women workers. Anne Stoller has established in her work on the Sumatran plantations that colonial employees commonly paid local women coolies wages that were so low, half that of men, in the expectation that they would meet their financial needs by other means. So company officials did this in part to lure men to work in this plantations, and also because they expected that women would just look for other sources of income. As railways were built to facilitate greater commerce across the Netherlands East Indies, migrant labourers also came to those sites where railways were being built, and the sex workers also followed around railways. It is thus clear that particular conditions of the empire or colonialism led to the use of nyai and also, or increased use also of sex workers. What about attitudes towards sex work in this period? According to Hesseling, Dutch colonial thinking was characterised by the view that prostitution was, quote, a necessary evil. Dutch opposition to prostitution was based on religious perspectives and the view that sex outside marriage was unacceptable. Indonesian opposition to prostitution and to concubinage also stemmed from Muslim religious condemnation of sex outside marriage. The organisation Syarikat Islam, for example, strongly opposed both the Dutch and Chinese use of local concubines, and they advocated that women prostitutes should be isolated in a women's colony and shamed as an example to other women. Following growing international attention in the 1930s to the trafficking of women, the Indonesian women's movement was also growing more vocal in condemning cases of women who were duped into sex work, especially following the so-called Lasem affair in the 1930s, in which the colonial labour officers reported the practice of bonded work or sexual enslavement of women employees in the batik industry. So these attitudes before the war provide some indication, perhaps, of attitudes to women who were recruited into the Japanese system during the war. But, as far as my research has revealed, there is very little information on community reactions during the war to this system, the so-called comfort women. and I'm looking for more information on resistance and protest from Indonesians. As I mentioned, apart from Indonesian and Dutch sex workers, there are also Japanese sex workers in the colony of the Netherlands East Indies, and I know one of the researchers here is working on this topic. So these women were known as Karayuki-san, largely poor migrant women from impoverished villages in Amakusa and Kumamoto in southern Japan. Some scholars argue that these Japanese women were actually the precedents for Japanese empire, the precedents for Japanese expansion, because these women, when they worked across different colonies, brought with them traders and then commerce and an increasing interest in the outside world. Chizumi Hirosho has documented how on the outer islands of the colony of the Netherlands East Indies, a stronger gender imbalance amongst Europeans and Chinese workers imported to work in the mines and agricultural work led also to a demand for sex workers. It was in that context that Japanese women followed this demand. Often they took on debt to finance the costs of their passage from Japan through to a colony, and they had to repay that debt. Most women travelled through the ports of Singapore and Hong Kong and the British colonies first, because these were established ports and they had direct shipping routes to Japan. They then travelled on largely to cities such as Medan, Surabaya or Makassar, largely to again the major plantations or other sites of coolie labour, including pearl fishing in eastern Indonesia. The topic of Karayuki-san has been quite well researched, and it's a fascinating literature if anyone wants to read on this. In Japan, it also has attracted quite a bit of scholarship. In 1972, there was a famous publication called Sandakan, Brothel Number 8, which is a novel based on the history of a Japanese woman from the Amakusa Islands who at age 10 was shipped to North Borneo and then a British-controlled territory with the promise of work as a cleaner. She was then forced into sex work from the age of 13 in North Borneo. This novel, however, written by Yamazaki Tomoko, based also on the oral testimony of one Japanese woman, tends to portray the woman in this novel only as a victim. In his pioneering work on this topic, James Warren advocated for a more comprehensive view of the lives of Karayuki-san by reconstructing as many aspects as possible of their lives, the surrounding city in which they worked, and using methods largely from social history. In a more recent study of Karayuki-san, Milhalopoulos strongly critiques approaches to Karayuki-san that tend to moralise and represent women in a one-dimensional fashion that also reflects the idea that ideas of today that female adolescents are entirely dependent on their parents. So he critiques the fact that such women are awarded no agency and the contexts of their conditions back in Japan are not adequately explored. So to recover women's agency, he, like Warren, calls for closer analysis of the local historical practices such that women's actions and their decisions to go abroad are understood in this concept. So to get beyond the perspective merely of exploitation only by other parties, he considers how child-parent relations worked in this period and the obligations of reciprocity and child labour. Across the literature on sex work in the colony of the Netherlands East Indies, a serious limitation in my view is that very few works capture the experiences and indeed motivations of women for engaging in sex work. Due to limitations of sources, it is easier to access information on the general features of sex work and its prevalence, rather than specific information on women's historical views concerning this work. So perhaps there are some lessons from this literature on the Karayuki-san for how we can research Yugonanfyu in Indonesia and also the history of sex workers in Indonesia. We have one rare account from a woman who was a former Yugonanfyu, in fact the first Indonesian woman to talk out on this topic, who was also a sex worker before the war. And her account leads us to think about the conditions in which some women sex workers found themselves before the war. So she provided this account to a Japanese theologian, Kimura Koichi, in the 1990s. She recounts, as it says there, in the last years of Dutch colonial rule, her family were facing extreme hardship. She had 10 brothers and sisters, and she, in that context, decided to become a sex worker on the streets of Solo to feed her brothers and sisters. She was the only person in her family who was working. And she recalled in her testimony that one of the most devastating aspects of being captured by the Japanese army was that she could no longer provide for her family. In Indonesian society, historically then, there were, and still are, some expectations that children will contribute to a family's income. Where possible, they will also support their parents. It is striking to me that Tumina narrates her story with seeming acceptance of the fact that she engaged in sex work to support the family. What this suggests is that, similar to the case of the Japanese Kariuki-san, there were broader motivations than individual need motivating women to work in the pre-war period I'm talking about in sex work, including the need to provide for families. But something that still remains unclear to me is the precise relationship between the Kariuki-san and the wartime system. We know that Japanese brothels and some of the Japanese sex workers were also used in the system that the Japanese Army and Navy implemented during World War II. I'm sure that you all have a general idea about the Japanese occupation of Indonesia. I just want to remind you that the Japanese were interested in the colony of the Netherlands East Indies before the war. There were Japanese businessmen here, who might have also come here through the Kariuki-san, who were interested in what the colony had to offer resource-wise. The Navy was also interested in expansion into the southern islands, south of Japan, to also compensate for the Army's expansion into China and Korea. The general approach of the Japanese was that they wanted to take over the Dutch colony because this colony was, in their view, resource-rich and labour-rich, and it could sustain Japan's war effort. The Japanese planned very carefully which local resources and which people they would exploit, and the lengths to which they were prepared to go to do this before they arrived in the colony. In order to try to appease male elite leaders, they promised joint participation in the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which would supposedly bring the Indonesian people into a new age of Asian prosperity under Japanese tutelage. Some Indonesians, at least, first believed that the occupation might offer more than they'd experienced under the Dutch. Expectations of dramatic change might have led some people to take on jobs that they might not ordinarily have taken on. But underpinning the occupation was the fundamental drive to exploit labour and resources, and for that purpose, local men and women were mobilised for a range of different tasks to contribute to the war effort. In this process, the Japanese used coercion by leaning on local leaders such as village heads and other people in society to recruit so-called volunteers. So we know that thousands of Indonesian men were recruited as labourers today known as Rorusha. The Japanese saw Java in particular, with its dense population, as a major pool of labour. Saito has estimated that 10 of the 50 million Javanese people were mobilised as labourers during the war. The Japanese required each regency to supply a quota of labourers for work both inside and outside of Java. Although there was continual coercion to keep recruiting new labourers, over time, as the war progressed, Saito notes that not all labourers were coerced in the end because, quote, the occupation impoverished people to such a degree that in order to survive, many had to accept any work that became available, unquote. I think that insight is very useful for us in conceptualising how desperate the conditions of the occupation made people that were willing then to take on unusual levels of risk to survive. And the same could be said, as I will argue, for Indonesian women. The Japanese viewed Indonesian women similarly as a resource for advancing the war effort. So they recruited some women to work in Fujinkai, a women's organisation which was largely directed towards domestic tasks such as making sure sanitation was upheld, supporting wartime activities, maintaining childcare, nutrition, first aid, savings, home education. Remarkably, the constitution of the Java Service Association, under which the Fujinkai came, records that Fujinkai members were tasked with striving for, quote, the mutual moral improvement and for the exaltation of the womanhood in Java. But despite this professed ideal, there are many examples of the ill treatment and abuse of local women by the occupying forces. And I have yet to determine how class played into this, whether it was mostly middle-class women who joined for Jinpai and lower-class women who were recruited to Yugun Yanfu. Further to this, I do not know if women recruited to Jinpai were also subjected to sexual violence. A significant problem, as I read across accounts, Indonesian accounts of the wartime, written by bystanders, is that veiled language is often used to infer the occurrence of sexual violence, perhaps because it's considered an inappropriate topic to reflect on. Now, there are several studies in Dutch language, Indonesian language, Japanese, and also in English of the system in the Netherlands and Indies. But in my opinion, these sources do not yet sufficiently combine documentary evidence with the testimony of women to reflect all the information that we have. We can use a variety of sources to triangulate information to reconstruct the experiences of these women. There are surviving Japanese military records, but these are scant and incomplete, and they provide some insights into how the system was set up and how they operated. There are also memoirs of former Japanese military men, and also records were kept by the colonial regime, especially in relation to post-war trials, which I'll talk about. Further to that, however, we have testimonies from surviving women, which I think we also need to pay attention to. Although they may be incomplete in terms of recalling every aspect of their detention, they do provide important details that we need to think about. So using these limited records and existing studies of the system, I'll now just provide an outline of the system across the colony. And I attempt in this overview to uncover the factors that also impacted women who were either recruited into the system or into jobs where they were also sexually abused. The Japanese researcher Naoko Yamada has provided an insightful overview of how the system began and operated in her master's thesis. She located evidence that in 1941, so a year before the occupation began, during a Japan-Holland trade meeting in Batavia, a Japanese military doctor called Fukada conducted a survey in Java of venereal disease. Fukada advised his government, a year before the war, the occupation, that comfort stations should be set up to avoid rapes of local women so as to promote local confidence in the Japanese. He wrote, quote, "Most people are Muslims and have strong feelings about chastity. We need to pay stricter attention so as not to have rape incidents in order not to make natives distrust the military's discipline," end quote. So the Japanese planned before they came to the colony that they were going to use Indonesian women. They were very careful about how they approached this issue, especially in relation to sensitivities about religion, and they worked hard to keep mostly male men on side. So we can see that there was early planning to implement this system even before the Japanese had arrived in Indonesia. And they were also concerned that they should protect the health of Japanese soldiers by investigating the extent of venereal disease in the colony. So, although there were connections between the wartime system and the Karyuki-san, I would say, in some of the methods that women were recruited through coercion or abduction, many scholars, such as Yuki Tanaka, suggest that the so-called comfort women system actually originated in China and is connected with the famous Nanjing incident. The original rationalization of this system was that by providing women in a comfort station, this would prevent the rape of other women. The system was also based on the belief that the provision of women was necessary for soldiers to satisfy their needs. This is connected to a myth that men, and particularly soldiers as archetypal men, have an uncontrollable sex drive, and that women in war are merely camp followers there to serve men's needs. The army also used this system in order to protect the health of soldiers by providing condoms and also giving the women regular health checks to make sure the soldiers were not infected with disease and therefore still able to fight. So the supply of women, we could say, was largely seen as part of the war effort. We know that there were differences in the system across the army and navy controlled areas of the colony. I don't have space to detail those exact differences, and the picture again is not complete. There appears to be quite a bit of diversity in the kinds of facilities used to keep women. This included movie theatres, bars, restaurants, hotels, and more traditional comfort stations across the Army and Navy controlled areas. Brad Horton notes that often hotels and old-style Dutch houses were converted into comfort stations. There was thus some continuity in the kinds of facilities used for sex work before the war and then during this system in the war. In her recent interviews with surviving women, the Dutch anthropologist Hilde Janssen has uncovered many less formal places where women were forced to provide sex with soldiers, such as railway carriages and women's places of work, including military barracks. Based on a substantial number of testimonies we know from surviving women, we know that there were comfort facilities across almost the whole of the archipelago. There were women detained, for example, throughout Java, throughout Sumatra, Borneo, Celebes, Buru Island, Bali, West Timor, Sumba, and also West Papua. So how were these women recruited? We also know that Sukarno was famously involved in the first stage of recruitment, which targeted Indonesian sex workers. So Sukarno famously assisted in this process when he met with a commander in Bukit Tinggi following his release. In his 1965 autobiography, he stated that this was an emergency measure for the good of our girls and our nation. I'd like to utilise the services of prostitutes in this area. This way the foreigners will be satisfied and will not ravage our maidens. So Sukarno's proposal was that the women who were sex workers in the area of Bukit Tinggi, 120 women in fact, be rounded up and segregated in a military district with high walls. Soldiers could visit once a week. The actions of both the Japanese military and Sukarno reveal their assumptions that the forcible detainment and use of women who were already working as sex workers was acceptable. They assumed women who may well have worked under freer conditions would not mind being held in a segregated compound controlled by the Japanese military. Tanaka argues that as the occupation progressed, and due to concerns also about venereal disease, increasingly the Japanese military began to recruit amongst women who were not sex workers. They sought increasingly to procure young unmarried women who did not have sexual diseases. In order to do this, they either tried to entice women with promises of other kinds of jobs, sometimes relying on locals to assist in this process, or they forcibly recruited women. Now, I believe that local officials, such as village heads, were also coerced by the Japanese military to supply women. Alternatively, sometimes the local army headquarters and recruiting agents or brothels were used to recruit new women. Sometimes Japanese and Dutch people were also involved in this recruitment. Apart from the role then of village heads in signing up Ramusha, which is famously known, several women confirm in their testimonies that village heads also acted as procurers. Kasinem, born in 1931 from central Java, for example, reported that at age 13 she was summoned by the village head. Japanese soldiers took her and other girls she did not know away, and they forced them into prostitution at an army brothel in Solo. She was forced to work there for 3 months. Rosa, born in 1929 from Samliki on the island of Baba in the South Malaccas, was 15 years old when her village chief sold her and sent her off pregnant to a Japanese naval brothel in the city. A range of local people seem to have been complicit in recruitment and in supporting the system, including doctors, officials of all levels, and people working in different industries, even entertainment. Hatono and Julian Toro suggest that the Japanese seem to rely on networks of trust among local people, soliciting help from people like neighbours, friends and acquaintances of young women. Young women were frequently recruited with false promises of training or jobs, often in faraway locations. In some places, women were promised training as midwives or nurses. A newspaper article published just after the war in Indonesia reported, for example, on a mission of the Indonesian Red Cross to repatriate 200 young women from Jakarta, Surabaya and Java. These women, after the war, it was found out, had been sent to Singapore and Sarawak, and they had been promised jobs as nurses with high wages and good food. Instead, they became comfort women. During the occupation, a village head in East Java also promised Suharti, then aged 14, schooling outside of Java, to be followed by an office or job or a hospital or restaurant job. She was instead sent by truck to Surabaya and then by boat on to Borneo, where she was forced to work in army brothels in Balikpapan and Banjarmasin. In trying to understand the position of young women at the time, we need to reflect on the local and historically specific cultural values. Hartono and Julian Toro argued that feudal and patriarchal values, whereby daughters had no rights to challenge their parents or village officials, contributed to the Japanese choice of using local officials, and also sometimes parents, to recruit women. And this is confirmed by the testimony here of Suharti. I'll just let you read that. So often young women agreed to go with village officials or other recruiters because they feared the Japanese. They had few alternative sources of information to discern what was a genuine offer, what was a false offer. They also trusted village officials that recruited them. Officials sometimes promised them large wages or schooling, which would enable many of these women to learn to read and write. So we need to think about women's limited educational opportunities and their economic circumstances also at the time of the war, to think about how it was that they could be, recruited by deception. As the occupation progressed, increasingly difficult economic conditions made job opportunities seem even more promising. Women were further attracted to jobs that did not require any skills, like housekeepers or restaurant assistants, because they didn't have to have any training for that. Lassian recalls that things were so difficult for her that she could not tolerate any longer her circumstances. She took up the first offer of work that was made to her without even telling her husband, because she wanted to buy food for her child. She ended up being forced to work as a sex worker. Martia, aged 16, from a village near Mount Telomojo in central Java, felt that she was in a similarly desperate situation. She accepted a job from a Japanese corporal as a laundry worker because her husband had been taken away as a forced labourer. She performed laundry work in the day in the military barracks besides the women's internment camp in Agarawa. She also had to lug stones and dig trenches, but at night she was forced to have sexual relations with the corporal, who called her to his bedroom. Mardia worked together with 20 other laundry women, all of whom were not allowed to go home and who at night were abused by Japanese soldiers. When we think about why many of these women, who were also sometimes young, would have agreed to take up opportunities, including opportunities to go to distant islands, we need to also remember that the age at which children worked at this time was much lower. And they were not really remarkable, so often we come across accounts of women aged 12, 13, 14 who took up these job offers. And in today's context that might seem extraordinary, but back in the time of the colony, this was largely accepted that children were okay to work, especially if they were above the age of 12. There were no regulations on this until, for example, 1925, and again the age limit was set at 12 for certain kinds of work being barred for children below 12. When we think also about why some women would have accepted job offers in faraway islands, so Mardiam, for example, from Yogyakarta, accepted an offer of a job in Borneo at the age of 13. We need to also think about, again, the opportunities that women might have seen through these offers. Because it is true that the Japanese provided some education and some training and some genuine jobs for women. And it would have been difficult for women then to decipher which information was true. There is also an argument that moving away from the confines of family control may have appealed to some young girls or women. And Sarah So, on her research on Korean so-called comfort women, has found similar contexts of why women left home as well. Mardiam recalls that she also had a strong desire to escape the strictures of her life within the Javanese court servant family. From the age of 10, she was confined to her house and living inside the court compound. In his work on women who ended up discarded on Buru Island, Kuliah Tamu also deduced that young girls or women smothered familial circumstances would have made it easier to convince them to run away or to fall into the trap of accepting false promises of a job or education. So I think we need to think about all of these factors contributing to the decision of some women to take up jobs and then become duped through this system. It's becoming clear that women were also taken by other means. I haven't seen a scholar point this out directly, but if you look across the testimonies, I think that we can also see cases where women were also directly abducted. There are reported cases of young girls being taken directly by Japanese soldiers and then forced to work in camp facilities. In interviews conducted in the 1990s by the Japanese researcher Fumiko Kawada in the area of Bandung, West Java, several survivors testified to this experience. Emmy, for example, reported that when she was 13 years old, a Japanese soldier took her from in front of her house where she was practicing taiso, a form of Japanese calisthenics. She was taken to a boarding house for Yugun Yanfu. Suhana similarly reported when she was a teenager, she was forcibly taken while out walking on the street where she lived. She was threatened with a bayonet by 6 soldiers. So several of these women from the area of Cimahi near Bandung, which is the area also where military barracks are located, recall that they were directly abducted. And I'm wondering whether the large presence of Japanese military in this area may have resulted in more cases of forcible recruitment or kidnapping by soldiers of local women to work in comfort facilities. It's also becoming clear, as in the case that I mentioned before of the woman who worked as a laundry worker, that some women were abused in other places of work. Paini, from a village near Mount Mababu in central Java, was aged 13 when she was also collected from her home by Japanese soldiers, together with her older sister, to work in the barracks near her village. By day, she had to cook and do forced labour, dig trenches, find food from local villagers, and although she could return home at night, she was often taken out by soldiers and raped. Several cases of sexual violence, therefore, indicate that this violence extended well beyond the ongoing detention in so-called comfort women facilities. They extended into other workplaces where women were within reach of Japanese soldiers or civilians. Women were constantly at risk of such violence, and they felt little capacity to resist, given women could also be killed if they tried to resist. I'm not going to say a lot about the case of Dutch women, because there's quite a bit of research on Dutch women, but we know that around 200 to 300 Dutch women worked in so-called comfort stations, compared to an estimated 20,000 Indonesian women, or that's only a rough estimate. Whereas local women were usually recruited through the methods that I outlined above, Dutch women and some Eurasian women were largely recruited by Dutch collaborators or by the Japanese military. They were recruited also from among former Dutch sex workers, also through advertisements and from internment camps. So from 1943 until 1944, when internment camps were handed over from civilian to military control, this forced procurement of Dutch women increased. There is a famous case of this woman, Jan Rafferheim, who's one of the most well-known faces of comfort women activism, who was taken from a camp in Ambarawa. I would note that the Japanese military seemed to be more cautious about using Dutch women compared to local women in their brothels. Discerning the extent to which women genuinely volunteered or knew about what they were volunteering from these camps is contentious. Living conditions in the camps also grew increasingly worse. There was less food, less clothing and medicine, and declining sanitation. So I want to argue that Dutch women's circumstances were also increasingly desperate. In some camps, the death rate was around 37%. There, women and children suffered from malaria, dysentery and beriberi. Under such conditions, the Japanese again tried to lure women who were facing these conditions into volunteering to become sex workers. As I said, I've been trying to trace what forms of resistance there might have been to this practice during the occupation. We know that some groups of people did try to help surviving we know that sometimes there were members of society who tried to help women, such as hiding them when the Japanese soldiers arrived. There are also cases in Java where villagers decided to return to the practice of pinggitan, or returning women to the home, so they didn't go outside the home so they wouldn't be seen by Japanese soldiers. In eastern Indonesia, there are cases also of village chiefs organising to marry off all of the young women who were not yet married, so they would be at less risk of being taken. And I've also found an interesting case in Sumatra from women in the organisation of local women members who opposed the use of Indonesian women in so-called yellow houses. And these women were quite brave in that they demanded that the Japanese shut down all of the so-called yellow houses, rumah kuning, because they were not in accordance with the culture of the Indonesian nation and religion of its inhabitants. And they managed to get the Indonesian women out of the yellow houses, and in response the Japanese sent in women from Singapore and Korea to replace these local women. But I feel that this part of my research is really not complete, and I would love to know if people know of more sources about how people responded on the ground to this situation. It must have been extremely hard also for families whose daughters were taken. Just quickly, reflecting on the conditions of detention, some of the things that I think it's important to note is that often women had no freedom of movement. If they were held in a so-called comfort station, there were guards in this station or high fences around the stations. They were not free to move. They did not have control over the number of hours they worked and the number of soldiers they had to see. They were subjected also to invasive medical checks regularly. They were provided with food, and food was difficult to come by in this period. Some were paid wages or paid in vouchers with the promise that at the end of the war those vouchers would be cashed in, but many women suggest that they never received money. Something interesting that I've also observed across the testimonies is that there were efforts to Japanize the women in this system. They were often given Japanese names, often denoting the name of a flower, such as Madiam was given the name Nomoe, I think, which means a kind of jasmine flower. Sometimes women were also asked to wear kimonos. So, in thinking about why this occurred, it may be that they were trying to give the soldiers again a sense of home by Japanizing the women who were there. Again, for some survivors, those Japanese names are very sensitive and bring back very painful memories for them. So young Rapohon, for example, refuses to recall what her Japanese name was. So I've just presented to you really what might be some of the beginning material of a book outlining what happened to women at the time of the war, but what I want to do beyond that is to look at what happened to these women after the war, and particularly what forms of activism have they and other people engaged in on behalf of these surviving women. So some of the key questions that I'm looking at, and you can ask me more about these in a minute, are why activism on this issue has been relatively limited, and why has it also been driven by Japanese activists in the case of Indonesian women. And I've been looking at the cultural, political and social factors that might explain this. I've also tried to look at how Indonesian activism is connected, if at all, with Dutch activism, given both groups of women were held in the same colony but under different circumstances. And as a scholar of memory, I'm also focusing on how memory is used in this transnational activism and how effective it is. Who has engaged in this activism and why have they done this? So I'm also looking at the personal histories of the activists, including Japanese activists. I'm just going to flick through these slides to give you a bit of an idea of where my research is going. So activism on this issue really escalated in the 1990s. Of course, we need to consider the decades before this, but the 1990s is really where women started to reconceptualize what had happened to them during the war and to talk about their experiences in terms of crimes against them. It was in this period that Tumina, the woman on the left, the first Indonesian woman, spoke out about her experiences, and then Madiem, the woman in the middle, and also Jan Rapohon, the most famous Dutch survivor that I mentioned. And they spoke out in a context where the world was changing, where there was new global recognition of sexual violence. And I've begun to trace what is the story of Indonesian activism, beginning with also the visit of a delegation of Japanese lawyers to Indonesia in 1993 to try to establish what kind of war victims there were in Indonesia, including Ramusha, but also so-called comfort women. And in this activism, one Japanese lawyer, Takaki Kenichi, is also very important. I've also looked at the role of some of the local organisations. For me, it is interesting that it is an organisation of ex-Heiho who are part of the Japanese military who have also been involved in activism on behalf of Indonesian women. And this also speaks about perhaps the fears that women might have of activism themselves or of being publicly identified as so-called comfort women. I've also looked at joint Japanese and Indonesian initiatives, which included the International People's Tribunal held in Tokyo in 2000, which brought together women from almost every case that was represented in this of the empire. So Japanese women, Dutch women, Indonesian women, East Timorese women, but also Chinese, Korean, etc. And from North and South Korea as well. After that tribunal, which was a tremendous international, transnational effort, a museum was also set up in Tokyo, which records the stories of all women around the world. And this museum recently hosted an exhibition on Indonesian and Dutch survivors, which I've written about. I'm also looking at cultural projects related to activism, including this photographic project called Trus Meisjes, which has toured around the world. And focuses on Indonesian women survivors and photographs of them. Other examples, again my title there is cut off, are a film made in 2001 by a young Japanese filmmaker, Kana Tomoko, centering largely on the story of Mariem, and also more recently this effort to memorialise the grave of Tamina in an area near Solo. So I published a couple of things on this topic. Both of these articles are freely available online if you'd like to have a look at them. And my conclusions are, I feel like I still need to know a lot more and look for more sources on the background to this system. As I said, I'm still triangulating information and I feel like there's still quite a few gaps there. But I do want to argue that it is important to use women's testimony to try and get at that micro detail about what women experienced. I think that the Japanese wartime system was unique in terms of the war period. It was unique, but it did draw on patterns that were there in systems of prostitution before the war and took advantage of these. In Indonesia, I also suggest that there are diverse patterns of sexual violence that we need to look at and not focus only on just the forced detention in Iamjo. And I'd also like to call for more research on this topic and for more research on the history of Indonesian activism and what Indonesians have done to try to confront difficult pasts. And as I said, there are many questions that still need to be probed, and I hope that you have some questions for me or suggestions for me, and thank you for coming.
Okay, terima kasih. Thank you very much, Kate, for this really interesting lecture. I think we learned a lot from this lecture. And perhaps for us, the term of comfort woman of Kuliah Tamu has been quite known as well. But we don't know actually what actually happened to these women during the Japanese period, why they were entrapped in this system and were mobilized in the system, and so forth. But Kate has shown us several very interesting explanations about the way they were recruited, also by connecting to the larger context of Indonesian culture concerning sexual or sex outside marriage, etc., and the practice of having women outside marriage. More than that, I think Kate also, attract our attention also on the issue of memory, of how this, memory of a woman tried to, resolved by Indonesians, and she questioning the very basic question why Indonesians has a lack of attention or less attention, for example, to this issue. And another thing, I myself quite shocked that to learn that the system was actually modeled after the one in China in Nanjing. We know that Nanjing massacre and the rape of Nanjing is quite famous, but how the system was then, applied elsewhere in Asia and Indonesia as well, and perhaps also other places in Southeast Asia, and that's really something we need to learn a lot, I think. But looking at this practice is not only on local practices, but also as a transnational practices. But also on the way the memory of this comfort woman, so-called comfort woman, was tackled by activism, by human rights activism today perhaps, but also historians. I think we have quite plenty of time for discussion. Now I invite you to ask questions or maybe to give a comment or anything you like, please. And I open the first round of questions, perhaps for 3 to 5 commentators. Okay, Bu Ida, and that's it. Bu Tuti, another one, please. You should be interested with this, because this is about the sexual thing, right? And it's a comfort woman. Okay, anyway, Bu Tuti, you can start.
Thank you. I want to ask you about, I have 2 questions. One about comfort woman or Juwanianfu in many places in Asia. There are many discrimination and racism here. For example, women from Korea and Japan give service for military with high level. Yeah. But women from China and other countries like Southeast Asia give service for low military, low office. Yeah. Okay. Is there any discrimination and racism in comfort women in Netherlands, India also? Racism like that. Yeah. And the second question is about Karayuki-san. I didn't find in the sufficient resources about Karayuki-san after 1915. Or I don't know about no resources anymore or no Karayuki-san anymore. Because after World War I, Japanese, the government campaigned that Japan will be civilized countries, the most civilized countries in the world. So the prostitution is very bad for this campaign. Okay, that is my question. Thank you very much.
So is the first question at the time of the war, pada saat perang, apakah ada diskriminasi antara perempuan? Is that right? Yeah.
Apakah ada diskriminasi di Indonesia juga seperti di comfort woman di wilayah lain?
So setahu saya mungkin ada perbedaan dengan treatment perempuan Belanda. Mungkin mereka dipakai untuk solda yang pangkat tinggi, ya. Tapi untuk informasi yang sangat lengkap, misalnya satu testimoni satu perempuan, kadang-kadang satu masalah adalah mereka tidak tahu siapa menjadi orang yang datang ke mereka. Ya, informasi tidak lengkap untuk mereka, ya. So, but menurut saya mungkin ada satu hierarki juga di situ. Tapi menurut orang Jepang, mereka orang nomor satu sebagai orang Jepang, dan wanita Jepang sangat dalam ideologi sangat dihormati, dan mereka tergantung terhadap peran wanita Jepang untuk perang. Tetapi ketika orang Jepang datang ke sini, mereka juga melihat orang Indonesia lebih tinggi daripada orang Belanda. Dari perspektif mereka harus buang orang Belanda, membuat satu budaya baru yang fokus kepada budaya Asia. Tapi dari perspektif perempuan itu menarik juga, ada perbedaan karena perempuan Belanda dikasih ke orang yang pangkat tinggi, dan cuma sedikit orang perempuan Belanda ini juga ya. So that's an interesting question, but I don't know if I have informasi lengkap. Saya juga dapat satu testimoni dari satu orang Korea yang ada di sini di Surabaya, but I don't have informasi lengkap mengenai all the women. I wish I had more information and cerita yang lebih lengkap mengenai setiap wanita. About the question about the Kariuki-san, yes, there might be a gap in information. In some of the articles that we talked about, there was reports from the Japanese consul about how many Japanese women were still here in the colony. And there were efforts from the Japanese government to ban the Kariuki-san, but I think a lot of women then went to the outer islands of Indonesia, maybe eastern Indonesia, where it was harder to control or implement that ban. So maybe on the outer islands there were still more Japanese women, but in the information about the system during the war, I do often hear mentions of Japanese women or brothel owners, so it indicates to me that there were still some people here, and I would love to know more about that connection too, but again, we're struggling with sources, trying to find the connection. Yeah.
Okay, terima kasih. Any questions? Steve, please.
Thanks, Katherine. Thanks, Katherine. Great talk. I know you had to cover such a wide range of issues. I really like the way that you tried to put it in a context that went outside the place and the time. So I've got a question on that front. You mentioned how the system seemed to be, or some writer, I can't remember who, said the system was patterned on what was done in China.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could give a little bit more detail on that. And secondly, you mentioned the Lassam case, but I didn't really quite understand how that established a pattern.
Thank you. So that scholar was Yuki Tanaka, who is interestingly also the son of a Japanese soldier, and he wrote a really interesting book about the Dutch women and Indonesian women. And Yuki Tanaka argues, and a number of scholars do argue, that we can see this system starting in China after the so-called Nanjing incident or rape of Nanking, in which many Chinese women were raped. The Japanese army decided that in order to try and appease local populations, it would be better that they did not commit open rape of any woman and instead collected women to be used by the military. So China is where the system first occurred. That's 1930s, so brothels continued to operate there. And there's a new book on Chinese comfort women that a Chinese researcher has recently written. And then the Korea, which was taken by Japan in 1910, Korea, the system was also quite intricate. But the interesting thing about Korea, because women were considered part of the empire, then they're sort of treated as Japanese subjects in a similar degree. About the Lassem affair, I heard this Lassem affair, which was the colonial report that discovered women in the batik industry had been put into bonded labour and were being forced to have sex as well. I would like to find more information on the Lassem affair. Sue Blackburn mentioned this in her book. What I was trying to establish was to what extent were Indonesian women also organising to take up concern about enslavement of women. Because from the 1930s there were also international bodies and concerns to stop the traffic of women. So it was already an international discourse in the 1930s, and I'm trying to look at how that translated in Indonesia. And then again, what happened in the occupation? What about women who were engaging in resistance? Were they also focusing on sexual violence, or I guess there were so many issues to take up? But again, I feel I don't have that story, and there's a gap there, 1930s to maybe 1950s. What happened? What happened in the war? So again, if anyone has ideas for more information, again, I feel there's a gap.
Okay, ada lagi? Ya, silakan.
Is there any relation between the woman's beauty and military contribution? I think, apakah wanita yang cantik itu akan diprioritaskan untuk menjadi comfort woman atau bagaimana?
That's like a difficult question, I guess, in a certain way. I mean, yes, but often it's seen that sometimes Japanese soldiers would come into a village and they might notice that there was one woman who was very attractive, and then they'd call the village head to bring that woman to them. So in some of the testimonies, particularly in the book by Hilde Jansen, some women say, I wish I was not attractive because of that experience. But sometimes I'm a little hesitant to just focus on women's attractiveness because it's no excuse for what happened to that woman, and sometimes I'm uncomfortable when a journalist starts a story with this woman is very beautiful, blah blah blah, because it's no fault of the woman that this happened to her because she was attractive. So I'm just hesitant in emphasising this over and over again. But there is a discourse, yes, that women who are very attractive were often picked out. And Dutch women too in the camp. Apparently there was also, they looked at the women, chose the women that they thought would be attractive to the kumpulkan. So you're right, there was selective recruitment as well.
I will ask you two questions. First, is there any violence against sex workers? And secondly, what Japan's effort to protect sex workers? Yes.
Was there any violence against sex workers, Indonesian sex workers? And were the Japanese protected?
So you mean the sex workers who were recruited into the system? Yeah, I think the treatment was probably very similar to women who were not sex workers. And what I'm trying to emphasise is that although there was, like Sakano's statement was that please take these women, the difference is that these women were now held in forcible detention. They were not free to control their income, to work when they wanted, free to go when they wanted. So for me, no matter what the background of these women, they're still forcibly having sex and forcibly being detained. So I believe the treatment was probably the same, but there were also efforts to be very careful about screening the health of these women, whether or not they had venereal disease, but all women were subjected to that when they started to have many soldiers come to them. And I mean, some of the stories are extremely horrible, but I didn't want to focus on the detail there about women also having, ongoing damage to their bodies, etc., and probably being hit and abused during the rapes as well.
I want to ask, there are village chiefs who collaborate with the Japanese and offer and get the women of their village to the Japanese. However, there are also the villagers who marry the women of their village so that they won't be recruited as the sex workers. My question is, are there any consequences for village chiefs from the Japanese military? Should they protect the women? That's why there are the ones who collaborate. Why are there people who collaborate with the Japanese, and why are the chiefs who decided to protect the women?
I only have one story of the chiefs who protected women in eastern Indonesia, and I guess they were just smart to think what to do. I guess everybody felt a general sense of threat with the Japanese there. If they did not obey their orders, they could be killed or imprisoned. So there was that general context. A lot of people in situations of war will choose to collaborate, but in this case, yeah, definitely the women were dikorbankan, yeah. So I can't discern, why this happened. But in some cases, there's also stories of village chiefs who might have had their own daughters who even then still gave them up or sent them away. So there were ways to try and avoid this happening to women. But again, I guess they were under circumstances of extreme pressure. It'd be interesting to think, though, after the war, was there ever any revenge against these people? Because collaboration also became an issue after the war. If you collaborated, or if you forced people to be ramusha, or forced people to be comfort women, I don't know the story after the war. Was there any backlash again? So once again, there's so many gaps here.
Yeah, please. Silakan.
tahunya itu kalau di Jepang itu ada tentang geisha gitu, yang soal menghibur. Jadi apakah karya lukisan ini sama dengan geisha? Lalu yang kedua itu, apakah Julian V itu, setahu saya seseorang yang ingin menjadi geisha itu perlu pelatihan dulu sebelumnya. Jadi apakah Julian V itu juga memerlukan pelatihan?
Well, I only can recall one testimony that I read recently of a woman who was being taught, like in the Japanese occupation, the general effort was also to make people respect Japanese culture. So people were taught Japanese songs, they were taught budaya Jepang, and to consider Japanese culture way above, especially Dutch culture, throw out the Dutch culture. The pictures of Queen Wilhelmina were taken down. And so there was an effort to orient people towards Japan. And I only know of one case of a woman being taught dancing, but I don't know specifically in these facilities if there was that. As I said, some women were asked to wear kimono, and maybe that's the closest thing. And maybe women in hotels, who were held in hotels or restaurants, were also forced to serve the men, like a geisha would serve men, you know, sake or whatever, serving before the next thing.
Small geisha.
Boleh menambahkan sedikit tadi tentang pertanyaan tadi, geisha itu tidak sama dengan prostitusi. Ya, ge itu seni, jadi sha itu orang. Jadi sebenarnya awalnya geisha itu seniman. Ya, jadi tapi sehingga untuk menjadi seorang geisha itu dia harus melakukan ada training untuk dia bisa bernyanyi, menari dan seterusnya. Itu profesi yang resmi dan berlisensi. Namun di luar itu dia kadang-kadang memang bisa dipesan. Nah, tapi itu bukan pekerjaan utamanya. Nah, jadi untuk prostitusi itu memang ada yang itu geisha itu saya katakan sekali lagi dia tidak bukan pekerjaan utamanya, bukan prostitusi. Ya. Kemudian untuk prostitusi itu ada yang berlisensi dengan yang tidak. Itu ada yang seperti itu. So it's one question for Ibu Katherine tentang the Meiji slogan, Meiji Restoration slogan, Fukoku ya, rich negara kaya dan militer yang kuat. Ya, tetapi mengapa untuk menjadi negara kaya itu salah satu programnya atau salah satu yang dilakukan oleh pemerintah Jepang adalah mengekspor perempuan. Ya, jadi pada waktu itu sebenarnya the problem is not, tidak hanya kemiskinan, tapi memang by design oleh pemerintah Meiji. Ya, dan itu sudah ada memang sumber yang mengatakan itu. Jadi mengapa pemerintah Jepang mengorbankan perempuannya? Jadi adakah atau mungkin something local wisdom atau apa atau budaya yang membuat pemerintah menjadikan perempuan itu sebagai komoditas ekspor? Terima kasih.
It's a very good question, and I think it is important to think about general Japanese attitudes towards women. As I said, like in the Fujinkai was actually based on a women's organization in Japan. And the doctrine of that organization was that women are at the center of the war because they're at the center of the household, and Japanese women are the most revered. But again, and then the organization Fujinkai was meant to exalt Javanese womanhood. So many contradictions with the reality. But maybe it's also a factor of class. You know, I don't know. These women, the Kariuki-san, are poorer Japanese women. Maybe the poorer women can always be, you know, ikobankan. And again, I have to look at class for the Indonesian Kampung women. Most women were illiterate, which means they were probably not educated, so probably a lower class. So again, class is another factor. There's one standard for this class and one standard for the other, I think.
Thank you, Kate, for this interesting lecture. I have received many information from this lecture. I don't have a good knowledge of this topic. I have two questions. First, I'm interested with your statement that Sukarno involved to support this practice of comfort woman. But I'm curious how the others Indonesian activists perceive this practice. For example, the more underground level, like Sahrir, who very strongly against Japanese and concerns with the human rights issue. How Sahrir, for example, perceive this practice. And second, I also curious how, if you have evidence, how the Indonesian military perceive also the practice. Do you have an account from the Indonesian military?
So the first one on Shahir, I haven't looked at what he said, but when there's an interesting article, I think it was, there's an encyclopedia of the Indonesia and the Pacific War, which is a wonderful source and has short entries. And there is an entry there on Fujinkai, I'm trying to remember the author, but she says that Indonesian women responded in 3 ways to Fujinkai. They either joined it out of fear, or they either joined it to mobilize for their own purposes, to use the organization, or there were women who completely rejected Fujinkai, which included Eska Tremulti. So women like her, who were perhaps also involved in the underground, I'm wondering if they would have more. But again, sources, so I need to look further. And it's a matter of whether or not this was an issue of concern. Because do these women, also women who are considered maybe lower class, is that the immediate priority, or are people more concerned about getting rid of the Japanese and getting independence? You know, I guess it's a matter of priorities of issues. But later on, in some of the publications, for example, of Gowani that I was reading in the 1950s, I did see them mention sexual violence in this period. So it's interesting, 1950s, where before activism began, they were already talking about this issue. Not in detail, just in passing, but talking about the, you know, the injustices of the Japanese occupation. And obviously the Indonesian left was most strongly resisting the occupation. So again, I think I should mine through both sources to see, you're right, what were people who were critical of the occupation saying about this practice. They were very critical of fascism and everything related to it. The question on the Indonesian military, do you mean after the war, or you mean PETA during the war? During the war?
During and perhaps after the war.
Okay, yeah. I'm not sure, but there's a little bit of a grey line here as well. As I said, because the Haiho were also part of the Japanese military, and the PETA also part of the Japanese military. So again, I don't have all the information here, but some Haiho were also prison guards working in these areas. So again, they might have more information on this topic. But I just wish I could find more examples of people resisting or doing other actions like that. But you're right, still more information needed.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, please.
Oke, masih sampai.
Ya.
Terima kasih. Jadi tahun 1992 mantan Chong Si-dae atau Junior Korea itu menyuarakan kejahatan perang militer Jepang pada untuk apa? Seperti upacara setiap hari Selasa untuk menyatakan kejahatan perang Jepang itu. Nah, tahun 2013 sendiri Presiden Korea kan diganti dengan wanita. Jadi isu itu dimunculkan kembali untuk terjadi konsolidasi antara Korea dan Jepang, sehingga tahun 2015 kedua negara ini sepakat untuk membungkamkan masalah itu, hingga pemerintah Jepang sendiri memberikan 9 miliar yen untuk intinya balas jasa untuk masalah itu. Sedangkan apakah konsolidasi ini berpengaruh ke Indonesia hingga menyuarakan kembali konsolidasi itu karena efek dari Presiden Korea itu?
There's a lot of things that I couldn't include in this talk, including the developments in Japan in relation to wartime compensation. Yeah, Indonesia and Japan signed a treaty in 1958 but in that treaty there was no money paid to individual survivors of abuses during the war. So that's kind of the centre of the issue for Indonesian activists later, when women start to conceptualise that I was harmed as an individual and I deserve individual compensation. The same for Ek Haiho, the same for Rumusha. They started to demand rights as individuals. And so the case that you just talked about, the 2015 agreement between Korea and Japan, one of the stipulations of that agreement, interestingly, was the monument that faces the Japanese embassy in Seoul had to be removed, and the activists didn't like that. The activists in Korea, also largely from the Korean Council, rejected that agreement because they didn't feel it was sufficient. But the question keeps coming back to what is sufficient recognition, compensation. That issue is not really clear. And you're right, but Indonesia's response, I have to say that today there's really, one main activist. Her name is Eka Hindra, and she is like the driving force of Indonesian activism on this issue. She's interviewed a lot of Indonesian women. She co-wrote the biography of Madiem, called Mamoye, and she goes to a lot of international meetings on this issue, but there's not a lot of support from different organisations in Indonesia. Komnas Perempuan has written a report including information on this case, and the case actually was included in Indonesian textbooks. In the 2008 edition of Indonesian textbooks, the story of Madiem was actually included, which is quite remarkable to me. But compensation, that kind of thing, there's not enough pressure in Indonesia for anything like that. And it is very, very sad that most of these women who engaged in activism told their stories, shared sometimes a lot of societal backlash for telling these stories. They did not end up with any money personally. They just shared their stories, and a lot of them lived in circumstances of poverty. So yeah, I would say Korea, Indonesia, this has not ever been a really big issue for the government of Indonesia. Maybe for a few individual politicians, but not for the government, no.
Still have 15 minutes at least. Bagus.
Okay, thank you again for your presentation, but I want to ask you what move this topic, but I think it's connected with the topic women in Japanese colonization. I ask you about how about children in Japanese occupation, because I hear a story about when Europe women to camp concentration, he bring children. When children grow up, these children is serve the woman in the camp. So I want to ask you about telling the story about the children in the camp. About the children in Japanese occupation. Okay, thank you.
Do you mean Dutch children?
Yes.
The Dutch children. Do you mean I should look at their stories, or you mean were they abused? Is that your question?
Telling about children Dutch children in Japanese occupation.
There are some very interesting memoirs, definitely written by women and children who grew up in that period and survived the camps. And I've done some interviews in the Netherlands with a woman who was a child in the camps, and she's actually been involved in negotiating between Dutch survivors and the Japanese government for compensation. And now there's a program also for children who were also children of Japanese soldiers and Dutch women to make pilgrimage to Japan and visit sites. It's like a kind of reconciliation. There's a very interesting article in the Journal of History and Memory about this new kind of reconciliation, more from a cultural perspective of children, facing this difficult past, the children of mixed marriages. But for Dutch children, it's also a very interesting story. What place does this history of the occupation have in Dutch memory? Because Dutch memory, of course, is dominated by the German occupation at home rather than this occupation of the colony. So you're right, that's another way to get at the stories. Interesting, thank you.
Okay, last question? Oh, there's still up to you. Okay.
does such term like comfort man exist during the Japanese occupation period? And then there's another question. Do you know any information or stories regarding Indonesian young men or young men in general who were forced to work in labor and then were sexually harassed or abused by the Japanese soldiers?
I think this is a very important topic. In the report of the organisation called the Project Implementation Committee, which was the Dutch organisation that negotiated with the Japanese government, not the Japanese government, sorry, the Asian Women's Fund, which was a semi-government organisation designed to pay individual compensation to survivors, but not from the government. That's why a lot of people thought it was very controversial. Anyway, in the report of this organisation, the basis upon which people could receive compensation was if they shared their story and could prove that they were, a Dutch citizen at the time, or a citizen of the colony at the time of the war. And people could give their testimonies anonymously too. That was very important. And there were actually, I think, 3 cases of comfort boys who did share their stories, Dutch comfort boys. But this suggests to me that it could be a Pandora's box. This could be far more common than we know. And again, it might be even harder, even more sensitive to open this issue. So, very good question, and I think we need to look at this. But again, it took women a whole movement of addressing sexual violence against women, seeing it as a crime, to enable them to think, I don't need to be ashamed anymore because, this was a crime against me. So for men, have we gone through that revolution? I'm not sure. It might be even harder. But great question. Thank you. And I think it could be researched more, but getting people to talk. Do we have a right to ask these stories? The same would be said for women. I also feel hesitant to ask women about their experiences of this horrible topic. So it's hard. It's tough research. Yeah.
Thank you for the time. Before I have my suggestion and question, I would like to apologize if my English is bad. And I'm not going to ask you a question, but rather giving you a suggestion based on information that what I've got. You see, I have a great-grandmother. She was from West Sumatra. And I do reckon from when I was in junior high school, I asked my great-grandmother about her living during her childhood. And I remember that when she was living in the Japanese occupation, she had a sort of a relation with a Japanese soldier. And I tried to ask more about it, but when I started to ask, she started to cry, and I had to stop until one at a time, when I was in senior high school, I tried to ask her again. And what did I get? That when she was around 12, I think, if I'm not mistaken, she had a group. In Indonesia we call it kajian, I don't know in English. And there's this her teacher that introduced her to this Japanese soldier. And whether I don't know that she had indulged herself for the relation, I don't know. But what did I get that before the war and the soldier, this Japanese soldier, was sent to battle. I don't know where, but she was promised that if the war continued, she will be taken to Japan to meet his family, the Japanese soldier family. Now, what I'd like to give you information that maybe you should do more research, not just around the government area, but to small organization, in particular a religion organization in some village, because my great-grandmother is really a religious person, and what really surprised her that it was her teacher that introduced her to the soldier. I think you should do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that story. In fact, I haven't found many testimonies from Sumatra at all. That's a question for me as well. I've heard of cases of women being recruited in Aceh, but not many testimonies from women in Sumatra, perhaps because people haven't done much research there. But again, your story indicates that the Japanese relied on these networks of trust in society to recruit women. That's sort of heartbreaking, you know, for a young woman that they used these networks of trust, including a religious teacher. But I think also, although I'm focusing on activism related to women who were raped and in violent circumstances, there were also some consensual relationships between Indonesian women and Japanese men, and Dutch women and Japanese men. And again, Evelyn Buchheim is doing some research on Dutch women who engaged in relationships with Japanese men during the war. But some of the early reports from Tempo magazine in the 1990s also reveal some Indonesian women who had sort of longer relationships with Dutch men, and again had promises that these soldiers would take them to Japan after the war, and sometimes had children with them. As a researcher, I think it's very important to award women agency, but to also think that there may sometimes also have been extreme pressure that they were taken by soldiers and forced to live in these relationships. In other cases, there may have been real love. So there's a blurred line there again. It's difficult to navigate, but of course there was a whole spectrum of relationships also between Indonesian women and Japanese men. And that's another side of the story, another important side of the story. But yeah, I think this is a huge topic, that's amazing. Your great-grandmother's still alive to share this story, and because the people who experienced the war, if they're still alive, are very old now. And it is hard to get these stories through oral history, but thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you. We actually still have 5 minutes. See? Still have a question.
Okay, thank you.
It's just like a kidding question. I always curious about comfort woman, the patterns of comfort woman. Is it true a comfort woman for explain about prostitution and some kind like that? Yeah, comfort woman, comfort man, and some kind like that for the pattern of like a prostitute, concubinates, and yeah, just to pattern.
Well, some of the patterns, as I sort of tried to indicate, like in the places women were held, were similar, like hotels or cafes or restaurants, so the places where they were held. And, you know, in some circumstances, perhaps where women were bonded as a sex worker, they may also have been not free to leave. But I think in the Japanese occupation, they were under military guard, you know, often with weapons, holding them there. So the circumstances in which they were held were perhaps different. And also the question of whether they received wages is a bit of a blurred line. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. Probably did receive food. But the main thing is that this was an organised system implemented from the top, also with instructions and systems of approval for how to establish a station across the Navy areas, across the Army areas. It was organised and it was planned even before the war that we would have these stations everywhere throughout the colony, right? So in a way it's more organised and it's a system that was, you know, highly implemented, replicated across the empire. Same thing in Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. So there's differences, I guess, in the organisation. But yeah, there are a lot of people have brought up comparisons with other armies to say, oh, isn't it just the same as another army? People do see this as historically specific in that it was replicated from China across the empire, I guess. Thank you.
Okay, well, please forgive me because I have a question as well. Well, thank you again. but since you use the term system, for me it's a bit interesting. Do you suggest that this practice of conflict woman, or whatever you can call it, is part of the war project itself? I mean, you can see now people also, scholars sometimes also include hunger, economic damage is also part of the war strategy to weaken the opponent, etc. And I think you open the chance that using the system, although maybe we also question to some extent it's really a system. Maybe we can compare between Navy and the Army, for example. From this perspective, we learn that the Army and Navy have different attitude to Indonesians' political movement at the time. Navy says it's more sympathetic, the Army is more brutal. To some extent, it's also affecting the system as well. But was it also part of the war project itself, imperial itself? That's one question. Second one, I think maybe it's common. It's really important is to compare between the survivor, combat woman survivor of Dutch and Japanese women, because they have different trajectories after this toxic ending. Dutch women, some of them will suffer more because they escaped from the mouth of crocodile perhaps, but fell into the tigers or lions even. I don't know if that's not the case for the innocent woman. And last thing, maybe you can share to us also your answer for the question why Indonesians activism it's a bit less enthusiastic toward this issue. Was it related to the issue of war and dress in the 1950s and later in the 1970s that Indonesia want to request compensation because for economic benefit, the Japanese agree to provide economic donations, or maybe it's also because it's the inconvenient fact that our big boom is also involved in this case. So maybe it's hesitant to take up the case into question, into investigation, even trial. So perhaps that would be the last question, I think.
Quite a few questions there. All right, so in terms of it being a system, again, I don't have complete information. Brad Horton has uncovered that there was a manual for the 25th Division of the Japanese Army that was in Sumatra and also Malaysia to begin with. So they actually had a manual on how they would run these systems, and according to the manual, all women would be voluntary, all women would sign an agreement in Japanese and Malay, although we don't know whether that occurred in reality. Probably it seems from the methods of recruitment, they definitely weren't all voluntary. In terms of system, do you mean was it designed to also, attack the people? Like, I mean, sometimes people say that women are taken as war booty, also to kind of destroy the morale of a country. But in a way, there's a contradiction there because the Japanese were sometimes careful that they didn't want to contravene religious values. And that's why they used sex workers first, but at the same time then they completely overturned that by recruiting any kind of woman. So again, there are many contradictions there. But it is, when this issue came up in the 1990s, I think I remember a quote from the Minister of Social Affairs saying that this is just a very, embarrassing, shameful issue for Indonesia, so it just should be forgotten. Whereas in South Korea, this has become an issue at the centre of Korean nationalism, to say, because our women were harmed, our nation was harmed, and therefore we protest against the Japanese government. So in Indonesia, it didn't take on this nationalist inference, although some activists tried to push it in that direction. And why that was so, I believe it's also connected to Indonesia's strong economic ties with Japan. the fact that when activism on this issue began, Indonesia was still in the New Order period, where there were very close economic ties with Japan, and I guess there continued to be strong reliance on Japanese aid. So who would rock the boat on behalf of these poor Indonesian women? Would it be worth rocking the boat in the relationship with Japan? But also because Indonesia was also under military-dominated society in the New Order, I think this issue was also sensitive because it was bringing up crimes committed by military forces against population of Indonesia. So it could have been a Pandora's box to support this issue on behalf of the government. In terms of Dutch women having a worse time, sometimes Dutch women were not held for as long as Indonesian women because they tended to be taken at the end of the war. And then some of these women were also released when high officials in the Japanese army found out that Dutch women had been held. Because there were particular fears that Dutch women, perhaps also as more educated women, might be more likely to invoke conventions like the Geneva Convention, which also would prevent the use of women in this way during the war. And indeed, there were post-war trials of Japanese people involved in this system who abused Dutch women, but not Indonesian women. And that was Dutch trials held at the end of the war. But definitely, there's also some sensitivity there from Dutch women. If you read the memoir of Jan Rofferhern, she mentions that after the war, the Dutch women who'd been taken to this system were held in camps, and they were separated from other women. And even other members of the Dutch society referred to them as whore camps, sex worker camps. So the women suffered a stigma almost immediately for having had this experience. But she also notes that some of those camps were attacked by pemuda from Indonesia. So one of her friends died in those attacks. So I think for her, there's also these layers of colonialism, and for her, a loss of her home of Indonesia, which she had to leave Indonesia after the war. But also there's a lack of reflection on her own implication in colonialism, and the fact that there were also Indonesian women suffering similar fates. For me, something interesting is she often looks to Korean women survivors rather than Indonesian women. So there's all these levels of colonialism here that are also at play across the cases.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. I believe we are learning a lot from the talk today, and you will see that there's a lot of chance for doing research about the topic and also about the period. Japanese period is a bit, lately a bit under-researched period. There's maybe a problem of resources, but I think if you try, you can make it. And we are glad that Bukuti is one of faculty members here doing research for the period, and we are hoping that more students, you are willing to take this period as a research period as well. So let's join me in thanking Katherine McGregor for her. This is another ritual for your lecture.